Hi, welcome back to the channel. Thank you for joining me. Today we are back with the greatest Jew that ever lived, Rabbeinu Yitzchak Abarbanel, and we will be exploring some of his commentaries on the Passover Haggadah. In particular, we will be looking at the 10 plagues. But before we get to the 10 plagues, I want to explore his answer to one of the classic questions, which is why exactly did the Jews go down to Egypt? What did this galut exactly mean? This galut of Mitzrayim became the blueprint for all the other four galuyot. And so he says that it's a very complex question. Did they go down on their own volition, or did Hashem decree that they should go down? And he says it's a very complex phenomenon, so it has to be examined from various perspectives. And oftentimes you will see that with Abarbanel, that you have many mefarshim, many commentators who will bring their own perspective, their own aspect. It's a beautiful and colorful palette of commentaries throughout Jewish history. But Abarbanel is very rich, and he will always look at things from different aspects himself. And so, of course, he says that the classic answer is that it was a punishment for the sins that Yaakov and his sons committed against Yosef, because, of course, they sold Yosef, they threw him into the pit, and they sold him as a slave. And because sin necessitates retribution, it was proper that their descendants also had to go down to Egypt. And because they committed this disgraceful act while tending to their flocks, tending to their sheep, divine justice demanded that they should too come down to Egypt on the account of their sheep. Because, of course, there was a famine in the land of Canaan, and the sheep didn't have any pasture to gaze on, and so they had to go down to Egypt. And because the way they threw Yosef into the pit, their sons would also be thrown into the Nile by Pharaoh. The classic Midrash tells us that Yosef himself wasn't so innocent. He was also guilty because he was a very vain person. He used to love to look at his own reflection. But not only that, he would oftentimes go to his father to tell on his brothers and complain about them, and he would slander his brothers. And we know that Midrash, and of course, that's a classic example of the truth of the Torah, because we are always told that nothing, absolutely nothing, can befall Israel other than what it brings upon herself. It's a very inconvenient truth, but this is a prime example. And Abarbanel goes a little bit further, and he says that even Yaakov was guilty. He was at fault to a certain degree because, of course, he was the father, and he should have created peace and love between his sons. Instead of that, he instilled rivalry and enmity among the brothers. So they both had to be punished. Now, on the other hand, obviously from a positive perspective, this was a kind of from the punishment perspective. But on a positive note, we can see that the exile of Yaakov and his family was an expression of the chesed of Hashem towards the Jewish people, because it was in Egypt that they really attained recognition of the one true God. And so Abarbanel goes on to explain that this entire journey was started by Avraham Avinu. He was born into a world where the vast majority of the people did not believe in the one true God, and he embarked on this mission to bring the knowledge of the one true God into the world. And there were certain beliefs in certain areas of the world where they didn't believe God existed at all. On the other hand, there were beliefs where they did believe in some sort of a source of creation like God, but they believed that he relinquished creation and he did not bother himself with the day-to-day life of his creation anymore. And so the hotbed of these beliefs was in Egypt. And so Abraham came into the world like a shining light to bring the knowledge of the one true God into the world. And so Hashem thought that the best To the best benefit of mankind, he would bring Israel to Egypt to demonstrate his sovereignty, his kingship, his power, where he could actually perform miracles. And so he sent the Jewish nation into the land of Egypt to then be able to redeem them from Egypt, which of course was the precursor to Matan Torah. Had there been no Galut, there wouldn't have been an actual nation in the numbers and how large they grew, and there wouldn't have been Matan Torah. So in this way, this Galut can be seen as a benefaction from Hashem, and it was a necessary step in the spiritual evolution of the Jewish people. They achieved holiness and ultimately acquired Eretz Israel. I just want to point out that in the world out there, meaning I specifically mean the Islamic and the Christian world, because I interact a lot in the online sphere with different people. And of course, the naysayers, the haters, always point out that the Jews are out there in the world because they are being punished by God. And one of the reasons we have the Torah Shabbat Pei, and the fact that it's not written down is because it is only for us. In other words, it's only for the Jewish people. The world has no access to it. And in this particular example, the world doesn't have any concept of the exile being a positive thing. Every time you read something online, what you hear is that the Jews are being punished. But we know that there's a positive aspect to the Galut, namely that, we are actually growing in number, we are growing in faith, we are growing in emunah, we are really being a light unto the nations. And the only way we can be a light unto the nations is if we are scattered among the nations and we can really show them who the true God is, or in Kabbalistic terms, we are collecting the sparks that fell down from the previous world of Tohu. But nevertheless, the world has no concept of the positive aspect of the Galut itself. So moving on to the 10 plagues, Abarbanel brings some examples from our sages, of course, the classic explanations, but the way he puts it together is just very, very nice. So let's look at the plagues one by one. So we have the plague of blood, which is a very famous one. And we know that the Egyptians were chastened with the plague of blood because they prevented the Jewish women from purifying themselves from their blood of the Nida, even though the Torah hadn't been given yet, but they would actually keep this mitzvah. They had an understanding of this mitzvah. They would go down to the river Nile and they would purify themselves by bathing in the Nile from their status of Nida. The second plague is the plague of the frogs. And quite famously, Abarbanel believes that these were actual crocodiles. So we're going to go with his narrative now, and we're going to speak about crocodiles as the second plague. So because the Jews multiplied in numbers in a great extent in the land of Goshen, they really became a nation of millions of people, over 10 million people. The Egyptians didn't quite like that, and so each time a Jewish child was born, the mother would need to go into hiding, and she would need to give birth in the bushes or in the forest, in silence, suppressing her cry during childbirth. And Abarbanel says that that's the reason why Hashem brought forth crocodiles from the water, who came out of the water and started barking, giving out this barking sound, this really annoying voice, which was midat keneged midah, for all the suppressed cries of the Jewish women. Okay, so the third plague will be the lice. The Egyptians' land swarmed with lice, preventing them from doing their work because they stole land from the Jews. So their land was not enough for them. They had to go into the Jewish land and steal that as well. While the Jewish men were tending to the cattle of the Egyptians, Jewish women would have to nurse the Egyptian children as well. Not only would they nurse their own children, but they would also nurse the children of the Egyptians. So that's why the plague number 4, which was the wild animals, were sent there to snatch these children and devour them. Now, something really nasty happened, and this is with the plague of pestilence, plague number 5. Essentially, I didn't actually know this, but the Egyptians would hitch the Jews to their plows to save the strength of their cattle. Imagine these heavyweight animals that had to pull the plow, very, very heavy work, obviously much stronger than a human being. And the Egyptians would have their animals rest, and they would kind of tie the Jews to the plows and make them do the work. And so that's why Hashem smote their cattle with pestilence. So that was number 5. Number 6 is the boils. Hashem smote the Egyptians with the boils, that they would not come to their base houses, and the Jews would be free to use them. So these boils were basically like a rash or an outbreak on the skin. It was like a skin infection, or shingles, or that type of thing. And so because the Jews were forbidden from using these bathing houses to purify themselves, to go to the mikveh, therefore Hashem said, okay, it's enough now. I'm going to prevent the Egyptians from coming to the mikveh or the bathing houses, and the Jews would be free to use them. So then we have the hailstones, which is plague number 7. They used to bully the Jews a lot, and they used to throw stones and pebbles at them, very similar to the way the Jews lived in the late Sepharad before the expulsion. They were constantly bullied in the streets, and it was similar in Egypt. And so Hashem punished them with hailstones. Okay, so we know that the Egyptians stole the lands of the Jews, and the Jewish women would have to nurse the children, and the Jews would have to work their own land, and they would also have to work the land of the Egyptians and their gardens as well. So the Egyptians would use them to plant different seeds, trees, and all that. And Hashem sent plague number 8, which were the locusts, because Hashem wanted the locusts to eat up everything that the Jews had sown for the Egyptians. Darkness is a classic plague, and our sages explain, of course, that 2/3 of the Jews remained in Egypt or died in Egypt, only 1/3 left, and actually they were sinners in great numbers, but Hashem again did chesed to them because he didn't want the Egyptians to mock them, so he brought about darkness so that the Jews would be able to bury their dead in silence and in darkness without the humiliation of the Egyptians watching. And the killing of the firstborn, which is the last and biggest plague, of course, requires no explanation. Abarbanel now ventures into the higher levels of the Pardes interpretation. He goes into the Sod, and he says that I'd like to explain these plagues as Hashem's means of demonstrating his mastery over all the 4 elements of creation. It gets a bit Kabbalistic now, very exciting. So the 4 elements of creation are earth, water, air, and fire. So each of the plagues would belong to one of these categories of the 4 elements. Okay, so the first category is water. So water turning into blood, of course. And Abarbanel explains that this had a multifaceted effect. Because first of all, the Nile was a source of everything for the Egyptians. It was a source of drinking water. So once the water became bloody, they couldn't drink it anymore, and they stayed thirsty. It was a source of nutrition and food for them, because they used to fish the fish in the Nile, and they would eat the fish. Of course, as a result of the blood, the fish all died off, and they were left with nothing to eat. And then, as we mentioned before, we had the crocodiles. So whilst the fish died off, the crocodiles, as a result of the blood, increased in number, and they sort of walked out from the water, just to emerge from the water to annoy the Egyptians. If you've ever met a crocodile before in your life, I've had the great experience of seeing crocodiles in their natural habitat in so many places in Central and South America, and you see them coming out of the water. You know, they walk a few meters out. They don't come out all that much, but they certainly come out and rest on the shore side. So they gave out this annoying barking voice, and it was really, really intolerable. Okay. So after smiting the element water through these plagues, Hashem then smote the Egyptians through the land in the next three plagues. Land meaning the earth. So first of all, the plague of lice had to do with the earth. And then he wrote about the plagues involving these wild animals that had to do with the earth. And pestilence also had to do with the earth. Now we are moving on to the element of air. So boils, like I said, was like an outbreak on the skin, was like a skin infection or condition, and it came through the element of air. Why? Because it says in the Torah that Moshe threw his staff heavenward, and it became an infestation of boils. Okay, so interesting. Okay, and then it gets mixed up a little bit with the next few plagues. Hail came through the element of fire. And then we move on to the locusts. Locusts were creatures that could fly through the element of air. Some other crawling creatures, he could have brought different animals as the plague, but he chose locusts because they can actually fly. And it was a different type of annoyance for the Egyptians. So that was through the element of air. Darkness was also brought about through the element of air, because it wasn't so much of a darkness, it was more the thickening of air that concealed the rays of the sun. Finally, obviously, the killing of the firstborn, I always wondered what it was like, how he killed the firstborn. And Abarbanel explained that the killing of the firstborn came through the element of fire. It was a miraculous airborne fire which suddenly entered their bodies. In other words, it wasn't like they were caught up in the fire on the forest, but it was sort of like an innate fire, something that all of a sudden struck them, and they burnt up from inside. So after he goes through a little bit of Kabbalah, explanations on the higher level, he now reverts back to the Pshat, and he says, ultimately, we can view the 10 plagues as a simple retribution for the evils the Egyptians inflicted upon the Jews. So now he goes through the 10 plagues again, but on a kind of literal interpretation level. So he says that the Egyptians used to kill the Jewish children in the Nile. They would drown them, and so naturally the children died in the Nile, and so the water became blooded. Because the Jewish women cried in anguish as they saw their children being cast into the river and drowning, Hashem brought forth the crocodiles with their cries. So the cries of the crocodiles was an echoing of the cries of the Jewish women. The Egyptians embittered the lives of the Jews by forcing them to perform hard labor with mortar and bricks, which came from the ground, and therefore Moshe hit the ground with his staff to bring about the plague of lice, as if to curse the ground which had brought his people such suffering. And then Abarbanel says that we have to remember that life in Egypt and the bullying that was going on all the time, it wasn't just restricted to Pharaoh and the royal family and his immediate entourage, but actually every single Egyptian, small or big, meaning in his social status in that he occupied in society, could do whatever they wanted to the Jews. And they were not only subject to Pharaoh, but also any Egyptian. And that is why they were punished by a mixture of wild beasts of all sizes who would snatch them from their houses as they did to the Jews. The Jews could not tend to their cattle properly because of all the work they had to do for the Egyptians, and they used to steal the cattle of the Jews, and because of that, Hashem smote the Egyptians and their cattle with pestilence. The Egyptians did a great sin. Another great sin is separating man from his wife, because of course when the wife is in the status of nida, he or she cannot be with her husband, and so this was a very grave sin. They separated them, the wives from the husbands, And that's why they were smitten with boils. Like we explained, the boils were a skin condition which also prevented the Egyptian couples from having marital relations. In terms of the darkness of the exile, of course, we always know that exile is synonymous with darkness. It's associated with nighttime. And the reason that Hashem brought about the darkness is because he wanted to show them that this is what you've done to my children. This is what the Galut has done to my children. And I am going to bring about darkness similar to how my children lived in Egypt. And just as the Egyptians used to kill the children of Hashem, so did he slay their firstborn children. So I hope that this gave you a bit of a new insight into the 10 plagues, and I wish you a Chag Pesach Sameach, a kosher Pesach Sameach, and hope to see you after the Chag. Thank you.